This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
Residents at Brightview Senior Living Communities enjoy enhanced possibilities, independence, and choice. Brightview Dulles Corner in Herndon and Brightview, Great Falls, offer vibrant senior independent living, assisted living, and memory care services through various daily programs and cultural events. Chef-prepared meals, safety and security, transportation, resort-style amenities, and high-quality care. Everything you need is here. Discover more at brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal housing opportunity.
Hello and welcome to episode number 278 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Hell, Nick M, Kat, Alan Smith, Swallowing Dragons, and Francesca Vuelemin. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is The Monkey. The Monkey was released in 2025. It has 6 out of 10 on IMDb and 77% on Rotten Tomatoes. When twin brothers find a mysterious wind-up monkey, a series of outrageous deaths tears their family apart. 25 years later, the monkey begins a new killing spree, forcing the estranged siblings to confront the cursed toy. Before we actually get into talking about the film, which I think will be quite a short review today, I am going to say that I am currently using a different microphone. So if the sound quality is different, it sort of picks up on a lot of the plosive sounds. So if the sound quality is different, or if you're like, hey, that sounds not the same as normal, that is why. I am currently away. So therefore, I am recording with a different microphone and I will be using my normal microphones as soon as possible. Anyway, look, so this film, right? It's fine. It's grand. Like, is it good? It's entertaining. It's not something that is going to blow your mind. I actually, I quite enjoyed the story, which I was surprised at. Like, it was fine and it was engaging enough. There's a really kind of nice absurdity to a drum playing monkey being evil and possessed and causing loads of deaths. And I was pretty here for it. The deaths were outrageous and silly, and there was lots of kind of vaguely comic gore. It was very Final Destination-y in terms of, a series of events that lead to a ridiculous death. So if that sounds like your thing, then this film will be right up your street. I also really like it in a film when people get their comeuppance. You know what I mean? I like seeing bad guys getting their just desserts, and there was an element of that in this film. It's also a kind of the type of film where you can watch and you can feel like, I'm not necessarily attached to any of these characters. You know what I mean? It's not very emotional. You're not watching the deaths being like, no, please, not you. You're just like, oh, another death. Okay. The acting performances were decent. Like, they were fine. Definitely watchable. There will be more on that later. And I just don't think this is a film that's meant to be taken seriously. So I just enjoyed it for what it was. It is the type of film that I think you need to watch with friends. You need to watch it, have a good time, sort of enjoy it, laugh about the deaths, kind of try and predict what's going to happen. Like, it's that kind of a film. And in terms of the dislikes, like, I'm going to be really honest, I fell asleep for a section of the film. I fell asleep. So, read into that what you will, take from that whatever you would like. It's not, as I said, the most wildly, interesting film to watch, but it is entertaining. I would have liked more from the villain, I think. And by that, I don't mean the monkey. I don't want to say anything more in case you do decide to watch it, but I felt like the villain was a bit like meh. I thought to myself, oh, you could have done way more with this. And I mean, the monkey's pretty evil, right? Which is also just a slightly ridiculous concept, to be honest. I kind of felt like I was watching Megan, you know, that film with the robot girl. It was in the same kind of ballpark for me. It's definitely not a masterpiece, and I think the script was pretty ropey in parts. Like, it's meant to be a kind of a black comedy, and I just felt like there were elements of the comedy that just really didn't land. And I don't know whether that was bad script writing or whether it was just the jokes weren't there. I don't really know. But all in all, like, it was just fine. God, like I said, this film review is very short. I think I'm going to give it 2.5 stars. Like 2.5 stars. That's fine. That, like, you know, it was grand. I wouldn't watch it again. I would recommend it with a group of friends so you can watch it and kind of have a bit of a laugh. This is very short. But look, there's not much to say about it. It's mediocre. It's a monkey playing a drum and loads of people die. That's all you need to know. Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about a podcast that I think you'll love. It's called Most Terrifying Places in America from Travel Channel. On the Most Terrifying Places in America, visit some of the creepiest locations across the United States. Go to a hotel in New England where guests wake up with scratches. And head down the back roads in the Midwest where a hitchhiker vanishes mid-sentence. Then meet the spirits of a Texas warship where the dead still walk the decks. On each episode, travel with ghost hunters, psychics and historians as they uncover the chilling truth behind America's paranormal hotspots. It's a podcast that's part cross-country road trip, part ghost tour. If you want deep dives into the most haunted locations in the US with input from experts from across the paranormal spectrum, then this podcast will be right up your street. Listen to Most Terrifying Places in America wherever you get your podcasts.
Residents at Brightview Senior Living Communities enjoy enhanced possibilities, independence, and choice. Brightview Dulles Corner in Herndon and Brightview, Great Falls, offer vibrant senior independent living, assisted living, and memory care services through various daily programs and cultural events. Chef-prepared meals, safety and security, transportation, resort-style amenities, and high-quality care. Everything you need is here. Discover more at brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal housing opportunity.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, this was a story that I was unfamiliar with, and somebody actually suggested it to me. Now, it's kind of more of a, how can I say this? More of a folkloric, urban legendy type story, but I really enjoyed it. So let's get into it. About 100 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River, right on the edge of the state of Louisiana, lies a city quite unlike any other. New Orleans is a powerful place, full of wondrous contradictions. On the one side, you have a bustling city of high-rise buildings powered by commerce and trade. On the other side, you have colourful terraced houses bursting with soul, music and mysticism. It seems so strange that a place like New Orleans could exist when her two faces are so completely opposite to one another. And yet, I think New Orleans was always meant to be the city that it is today. Going all the way back, the indigenous tribes who called it home first used the large waterways and bayous to congregate and exchange with each other. Bulbancha, they called it. Nothing like the name New Orleans has today, and yet it is exactly the same. Bulbancha translates roughly to the land of many tongues. Many tongues for many people, all of them coming and going through New Orleans in search of connection, trade and prosperity. The water was rich, the land was green and the resources were plentiful. Its direct access to the Gulf of Mexico made it the perfect spot to venture out to sea, and the many rivers and bayous made the perfect safe havens for those coming back in after a long journey. So perhaps it's no surprise that the French were eager to hold on to it when they claimed the land as their own in the 18th century. It was actually the French who gave the city the name that we recognise and know today. Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, acted as Louis XV's regent over the colony for almost a decade and gave the name of his ancestral seat to this new territory. Over the years and through language changes, the city that had been La Nouvelle Orléans transformed into New Orleans. We now recognise it for its unique music, for its Creole cuisine and dialects, for its zest for life and colour and expression, and for its legendary festivals like Mardi Gras. But just like it always has been, New Orleans has two faces. Thinly veiled behind the vibrant, pretty facade lies a deeper, darker undertone of mysticism. Alright, I'll admit it, it's not a very discreet side of New Orleans at all. Voodoo shops, fortune tellers, mediums who commune with the dead, and magic paraphernalia can be found around every corner and behind proudly displayed shop signage. And all of that, of course, is without even getting into the topic of the undead. From Interview with the Vampire to more contemporary series like the Vampire Diaries spin-off The Originals, New Orleans has played the backdrop to some of our most iconic vampire stories. But why? Why, out of all the cities and all the mystical places in North America, does New Orleans seem to be the designated vampirical homestead? Well, as the saying goes, where there's smoke, there is fire. It all comes back to that land of many tongues. With the burst of European settlers in the 18th and 19th century, culture brushed arms with culture, exchanging, growing, morphing into something else entirely. The Slavs and the Romanians, cresting on tropical American soil for the first time, brought with them folklore and tales of horrors otherwise unknown. Eastern Europeans already had centuries worth of dark warnings of creatures who came back from the dead to steal the life from the living, and now they were to introduce them to the new world. A vampire to them was a horribly disfigured monster, their skin darkened and bruised from consuming blood. These bloated, reanimated corpses were usually the result of a suicide or possession. They could be created by a witch, or a victim could find their dead body taken over by the vampire who had bitten them. They usually struck at night and returned to their graves by day, where they could be found and killed by a stake to the heart. The French, who now ruled New Orleans, had their own tales of those they called revenants. These undead spirits were said to return from the grave to plague the living, driven by an insatiable and incurable lust for blood. And as New Orleans briefly changed hands to the Spanish, they brought with them the stories of El Vampiro, a deadly creature that lurked in the shadows, hunting and preying on unsuspecting victims from the darkness. These folklores and legends laid the foundation for what was to come. But New Orleans was still centuries away from what could arguably be called their most infamous vampire story yet. The city itself had just stepped into the 20th century, and it was doing it in style. There was no drink left unpoured, no song unsung, no dance ignored, as New Orleans burst into the roaring 20s. Life was fast, and the party went on all night, every night. No one worried or cared about work in the morning, because work in New Orleans was always easy to come by. Thousands flocked to the city, that was now being affectionately called the Big Easy, and a person in search of a job never went home empty-handed. Trade and business was booming, And because of that, the good people of New Orleans had plenty of cash to spend. The prosperity brought with it a sense of freedom and opened the doors to all manner of behaviour, good and bad. The people danced all night in the clubs to this iconic new music genre called jazz, and the women took their pick of the fine young fellas who could afford to buy them whatever drink they wanted at the bar. Excess was key, and there was little thinking of the future. There was also little thinking about danger, and danger has a way of creeping up on anyone, especially those who least expect it. Within a decade, the Great Depression had ravaged New Orleans. Jobs that had once been plentiful were now few and far between, and people who had partied all night were now left begging on the streets for handouts. The have-nots of New Orleans could often be seen sitting on porch steps with cheap plates of food in their hands that they had earned in exchange for their labour. And it was in the middle of all of this desperation and need that one particularly disturbing story would emerge. It was 1932, and a police officer on patrol on Royal Street was interrupted in his duties. Before him was a young girl. She looked just as malnourished and dirty as many other young girls did during the Great Depression, but there was also something else that was incredibly unnerving about this one. She latched on to the officer, clearly in a panic and clearly visibly injured. She had bloodied bandages around her wrists, and as she grabbed the officer's attention, she told him that there were other people just like her, further down the street. They were all being held captive in a house the girl was willing to risk going back to if it meant saving the others. The officer wasn't exactly quick to believe this girl's claims, but he also knew that the right thing to do would be to corroborate her story. He rounded up a few of his fellow officers and agreed to follow the girl to the house. There, they would all walk in on a horrifying scene. Bound to chairs were 4 other people, injured and bandaged up just like the girl was. But these people looked half dead. In the corner, filling the room with a terrible stench, were the remains of the people who had sat in those chairs before them. According to the girl, and those who could muster up enough strength to speak with the officers, they were all being held captive by 2 brothers, John and Wayne Carter. By day, these 2 allegedly carved out a living for themselves on the river, but by night, they returned and took what they wanted from their victims. Every day at dusk, the brothers entered the house and selected their next victim. They would then remove the person's bandages, slice their wrists open with a knife, and they would collect their victim's blood in a cup and drink it. Once the brothers had their fill, they would redo the bandages and leave. They never fed their captives or gave them water. The only thing they did was put the bandages on their wounds before leaving. According to the survivors, the brothers wouldn't even speak during this ordeal, but simply acted on routine. All of the other victims, including the ones who had already perished, were adults, but the Carter brothers had made a fatal mistake when deciding to kidnap the young girl. The methodical and almost detached way that they had drained their victims to death had all been worked out by then. There was a rhythm to it, a choreography, but the young girl was a change to the natural flow the brothers had put into place. It hadn't been a choice to take her with them, but she had stumbled upon them kidnapping another victim, and the 2 had been forced to take her as well or risk her reporting them. They had her tied to a chair and had drunk from her like all the others, but the girl was smaller than anyone else they had attacked before. Unfamiliar with her size, when the brothers redid her bandages and the ropes around her wrists, they did them too loosely. The girl had then had the foresight to wait until the brothers had left for the day before taking a risk and escaping. She flew down the street, and one of the first people she came into contact with was none other than an officer of the law. It was thanks to her courage and the information that she was able to provide that a team of law enforcement were able to lie in wait for John and Wayne Carter to return that evening. So the story goes, John and Wayne were average-looking men of no particularly great height or build, but it took 8 officers to hold them down and detain them. But it is also here that the Carter story splits. In one version, the brothers were relieved to have finally been captured. They told the arresting officers that they had been plagued by an insatiable bloodlust and wanted to be free of the cycle of killing. They hadn't wanted to murder anybody. They'd simply been starving. But another version of the story says that the brothers fought their way back out of the apartment, tooth and nail, and showing an incredible otherworldly strength. It took an even larger posse of law enforcement who were in turn armed to the teeth to track them down and make them face the consequences of their brutal actions. The brothers were brought before the courts and found guilty of murder. Their sentence was a simple but definitive one: death. They were led to the gallows and hanged, bringing an end to the bloodlust that had ruled their waking lives. And, as is the custom in New Orleans, their remains were interred in the family crypt, above ground, and in full sight of anyone who would be reopening it to, say, inter another family member. That is what happened a few years after the Carter brothers had been executed. But what would happen then would shock the community of New Orleans. In a warm and humid place like the Crescent City, decomposition happens quickly. In the year or two that had passed between John and Wayne's internment and the addition of the remains of their relative, all there would have been were bones. But when the crypt was reopened, it was completely empty. The brothers were gone. Was it possible that someone had taken their remains, maybe even to use them in a ritual or a spell or even to worship? Was there something else going on? Once news of the missing bodies spread, the people of New Orleans started to put 2 and 2 together. They had seen men around town who had resembled John and Wayne, but everyone had brushed those sightings off because everyone knew the brothers had been executed. But now no one knew where the bodies were. And how can you prove that someone is dead if you can't produce the body? So the story goes, sightings of the Carter brothers continued in the years after their executions. Some even claim to have seen them today. And if the Slavic folklore has taught us anything, it is that the only way you can kill the undead is with a stake through the heart, not a noose around the neck. But the Carter brothers aren't the only reported vampires believed to still be roaming the streets of New Orleans. In fact, there are many. Perhaps some that we will get into in a later episode, but there is one particular vampire who relates directly to this case that I feel that we should mention here today. One of the legends surrounding vampires is that if a vampire drinks from a person 7 days in a row, that person will also be transformed into a vampire. And one of the victims, who had been tied to one of those chairs, is believed to have survived their 7 days. According to the Carter brothers' lore, that victim, though they are not directly claimed to have also been a vampire, turned into a mass killer themselves. If the accounts are to be believed, this person killed a total of 32 people before they too were captured. And this person was also discovered to be drinking the blood of their victims. That certainly sounds vampiric to me. For those of you still curious to venture further into the dark underworld of New Orleans, there is a house on Royal Street in the French Quarter that is believed to be the very house that the Carter brothers kept their victims in. You are able to visit it, although from the outside it looks quite charming and peaceful and nothing like you would imagine a house that had been the scene of torture and murder to look like at all. I'll leave it up to you whether you believe that it is really where the Carter brothers did their dark deeds. But I can tell you that the current owner certainly believes the stories. In fact, they believe that they have laid eyes on the Carter brothers themselves. The current owner claims to have come home one day to see two strange men talking on the third floor balcony of the house. The doors were locked, and the men shouldn't have been able to get in without a key, unless they had somehow broken in. So the homeowner approached carefully and with half a mind to call the police. But the two men spotted the homeowner before they could. The men, who had been whispering quietly to each other, then suddenly leapt from the third floor and down into the street. They jumped down like it was nothing, and then took off running and disappeared into the night. Who knows if the two strange men seen that night were, in fact, John and Wayne Carter. All I know is, I'm not too eager to go there and find out for myself. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say is that I just cannot say New Orleans correctly. Okay? I just can't do it. I'm probably never going to get it right, and I apologise. Secondly, there is no historical evidence about this story. Okay? So basically, there's kind of, this is a story from the 1930s. Like, this is not a story from 17 Dickety 2. Like, this is recent in terms of human history. And there is no evidence of this actually happening. And if you think about, this time period, news was pretty instantaneous, local news. So it would have been in the news if these two brothers had been executed because they were killing people and drinking their blood, multiple people. But there is no evidence that these brothers existed. I mean, Carter brothers existed, of course, but brothers that were vampiric and were drinking blood and then their bodies disappeared, there's no evidence of this. This story is an absolute staple, though, on New Orleans ghost tours from what I can gather. So the story is being told and retold all the time. So there's kind of different versions and different variations of the story where, like I said, in one of the versions, the brothers were like, please stop us from this bloodlust. And another version, like one of them jumped off the balcony and ran, and they were like fighting off all of these big police officers and, were eventually apprehended and executed. So there's varying versions of this story. But fundamentally, vampire lore really goes hand in hand with New Orleans and New Orleans folklore and myth. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And on like a basic fundamental level, vampires exist in New Orleans. And by that, I mean real people who identify as vampires, who say they are vampires and drink each other's blood at parties, etc. That exists. That exists kind of all over the world. So in that regard, vampires exist in New Orleans. I do think it's fascinating that variations of vampire lore exist all over the world. I think it speaks to like the recognition that blood is the human life force, and therefore, there is an entity, a horror that can come and drain you of that. I also think there's a recognition of, people's fear of death and fear of people coming back after they die. I mean, bodies have been excavated all over the world, like real human bodies that have been buried with maybe, an iron chain around their neck, etc., with the belief that this person was a vampire and was going to come back. And I think that a similar thing has happened with this story as happened with the episode I did a couple of weeks ago about the Far Goethe, which was a fairy story of this hideous entity that emerged from stories of the Great Hunger in Ireland. And it sort of feels like when people go through these periods of intense social upheaval, like, for example, the Great Depression, that these horrific stories emerge. And it's interesting that this particular story is about bloodlust, and it has this cannibalistic nature. And there are lots of stories around cannibalism during these great periods of social upheaval, because obviously the Great Depression impacted people greatly, and similar, the Great Famine in Ireland impacted people greatly, and there were reports of cannibalism. Now, some of those reports, are just fundamentally not true. And if reports were true, they were very isolated, tragic incidences where people were fundamentally just so starving that they resorted to cannibalism. And that's shocking and horrific. And I'm sure those stories magnified and spread around this period of time and just afterwards. And I wonder if this sort of vampiric set of brothers who were, surviving by drinking the blood of these unwitting victims, I wonder if that is born out of the horror that people were experiencing during the Great Depression. Because we often seek to understand the world around us with these kind of folkloric, supernatural, paranormal stories. They are often just a way for us to talk about tragedy. And I do particularly love this story because it has survived. We're still talking about it now. People are still telling the story to this day. The owner of the house is still saying, I believe that this particular house is haunted, or these brothers, or the vampires that are these brothers, were physically in my house. Now, is that more to do with keeping the house on the map? I don't know. But I do think that stories of vampires really engage with something that's like deep in our human psyche, and I love it. I think it's really fascinating. So that was a little bit different. I know, like I said, it's pretty much an urban legend. It is in the realms of folklore at this point, but it is still a staple in New Orleans ghost storytelling, and I'm a big fan of that. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Remember, if you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.